Passer la parole à notre collègue qui est campagneur sur l'énergie nucléaire à Greenpeace International et qui va nous parler de ce qui se passe en Belgique, et notamment de l'absence du plan national. Qu'est-ce qu'il dit, M. Gariba, là? Il n'obéit pas à la directive européenne? Allez-y.
D'abord, merci pour l'invitation et je suis très heureux d'être ici. I will continue in English if I may. I'm very happy to be here, but I'm also a little sad. And if you find my presentation, I will show you why. My dearest colleague, Éloi Glorieux, is retiring this week. Many of you know him. He has spent his whole career in the first place on nuclear disarmament, but also on nuclear phase-out. You could say he's the father of the nuclear phase-out in Belgium. So he's retiring. He's going to be a nature guide. So if you want to visit the Forêt de Soigne, he can guide you around about climate change and nature and so on. But so, yeah, I'm replacing him. It will be maybe a bit more rusty. I'm not up to speed entirely. That's Éloi. Many of you know. So I would like to thank Éloi for decades of activism and expertise, and I'll try to. I learned a lot from him. So thank you. Belgium. So if you take the next slide. It's a lot like France. So after Swedish copper, we're back to clay. And there are a lot of similarities. We also have a lot of bitumized waste. Part of that is from the old Eurochemic installation, reprocessing plant in the 70s mostly. And so we have very similar problems as described by Dr. Thuillier. So we also commissioned this report together with Greenpeace France from Dr. Thuillier, and so he has already explained. I'm not going to repeat all the arguments that he so well explained to you. Basically, it's highly questionable if we ever will be able to dispose radioactive waste deep geologically in the clay layers. But looking at the volumes and categories, of course, every country has their own definition. So we call it category A, B, C. B is intermediate level waste, but non-heat generating. And then C is high level waste, heat generating and long living. And so anyway, in Belgium, we will have, for the high level waste, will have two categories, being spent uranium oxide and spent MOX. And Belgium reprocessed spent fuel in La Hague. That's 672 tons. It was stopped by in Minister Poncelet. By the way, in December 1998, Mr. Poncelet, who became director of Foratom after, so we're very grateful of his service as Minister of Defense and Energy at the time to stop reprocessing. Remarkably, if we read the second report of Belgium to the European Commission in the context of the European directive, officially Belgium is planning to reprocess another 1,000 tons of spent fuel somewhere in the future, in the far future. And so that's my next slide. Previous. Yes, this, yeah. So this is an official position of Belgium that another 1,000 tons will be reprocessed somewhere, probably in France, on top, including the spent MOX, which was used in Belgian nuclear reactors. And so this will come from wet storage sites in Thiange. In Doel, we are mainly transferring spent fuel from the inactivation pools to dry storage containers. And the question then will be, of course, if you read that, Belgium has a nuclear phase-out by 2025. Some are questioning that it will be extended for 2 reactors of 7 by 10 to 20 years. But anyway, Belgium is in the process of a nuclear phase-out. So what, in case Belgium would reprocess another 1,000 tons, there's no clarity about what Belgium will do with the separated plutonium or reprocessed uranium. So that's an interesting question that is arising from this publication. Next slide. If we then look at the high-level waste in the plan that was proposed by ONDRAF, which is the equivalent of ANDRA in France, it's the Nuclear Waste Authority in Belgium, ONDRAF-NIRAS. In 2011, a plan was, or nuclear waste plan was published, focusing on clay. In the first place on the boom clay, which the NIRAS and the Nuclear Research Center already have a nuclear laboratory there now for about 30 years to study the feasibility. And that's at 220 meters depth. This clay layer, the boom clay layer you see on the left side, bottom left side. It's very close to aquifer, it's fractioned, it's layered, and it's very thin. And so, as Dr. Thuillier has explained, if you dig a tunnel in such a clay layer, you disturb the clay layer, and that's 8 meters for the tunnel, and then you have to count disturbance of about, in total, 40 meters. With a clay layer which is around 100 to 120 meters thick, which is layered, which has also sand and silt, and which is very close to an aquifer on top of that, which is used. That's highly problematic. In the plan to go deeper, it would be the Ypresian clay, and then you need to find 2 conditions. It has to be thick enough and it has to be deep enough. And previous slide, please. Yes. And then you really look at very close to the Dutch border. And that's not as well. That's actually the informal policy of the Netherlands and Belgium, that the nuclear waste stockpiled at Kovra, from mostly from the Borssele nuclear power plant, will probably be dealt with in cooperation with Belgium, by Belgium, probably on Belgian territory, but very close to the Dutch border in a clay layer. So if there's a problem with the Belgian program, there's also a problem with the Dutch program. And that's not a formal position, but it's like a public secret that this is the plan of the Netherlands. Then next slide. This is a bit of a summary of all the arguments very well explained by Dr. Thuillier, so I'm not going to repeat all this. So it's all the questions about hydrogen production, explosion and fire risks, and a specific issue here is that, which is maybe more explicit or more different from France, is that the official policy of Belgium is also to put spent fuel into the clay layers, and that requires super containers, which are rather large. You can question the feasibility of handling such large containers in the underground. Also, and that's different from the Bure and the French project, it will be a vertical shaft, so lowering the containers not into a slope, but just dropping it. If something happens with a spent fuel container dropping 400 meters deep, that might be a serious problem, including possibly for criticality, because in the, for instance, spent MOX, there's a lot of plutonium. There's also still some uranium-235 in there. So there's some issues that are maybe different from, or more explicit from the French situation. Next slide, please. So, in terms of the process, because we got a presentation about the 2011 directive, and there are some interesting issues there for Belgium. So, 2011, the Waste Authority, ONDRAF, published its waste plan. There was a strategic environmental impact assessment. There was a public consultation. There were, not surprisingly, a lot of objections. But more, and Greenpeace also published this report about the similar issues as Dr. Thuy has explained, about the quality of that clay layer, the geological aspects of it. Remarkably, and that's actually 2015, the nuclear regulator, that's not the waste authority, but it's the equivalent of ASSE in France. It's the nuclear regulator who needs nuclear licensing for such a plan, was very critical of that plan from ONDRAF. Basically, it concluded that it's not yet possible to choose for clay, and I will elaborate on that a bit later. Following that, the Belgian government has demanded ONDRAF to look at it again and to look at all deep geological options, not only clay. And so that's what ONDRAF is supposed to do now. But practically speaking, they have a lab in the clay layer of Boom, and that's what they're still doing. So in this year, and I'm sorry I'm not up to speed on that yet, so I cannot give you more details, but this year there's supposed to be a new strategic environmental impact assessment, and I have no timing at this, but we definitely have to closely watch this. Next slide. So I think this is interesting what actually the federal agency, the nuclear regulator, said about this 2011 plan. It first said that, as of today, no safety analysis has been presented to the regulator demonstrating that, I translate as soft clay formations, offer sufficient performances for the confinement and isolation. And the next is very interesting, is referring to the optimization principle. And for those who are familiar, in radiation protection, that's an international regime coming from ICRP recommendations transposed to EU directives, to national legislations. So it's universal, not unique for Belgium. So the three pillars of radiation protection are justification, limitation, and optimization. And so one of these pillars means that, also referred to as the Ilaria Principle, that you need to keep the risks or the dose to the population as low as reasonably possible. If you can lower the risk, you have to lower the risk. And so the agency said, well, you only looked at clay. And so you should actually look at all the different options, and then from a technical point of view, we should choose for the safest, reasonably available technology. And that has not been done. So it's a very formal problem. And if I then hear that in France this process was not done explicitly, only looking at clay, and actually like granite was never technically studied. If you look at the opinion of the Belgian regulator, referring to universal legal principles, which are really at the core, we call them the three pillars of the radiation protection regime, there might be a problem also in other countries not respecting this principle. So that's why I talk about this a bit more extensively, and so as things in Belgium are also available in French, that might be interesting to consult. Next slide. So quickly, as there is nothing formally in terms of approved plan in Belgium, there's nothing. So European Commission is not entirely happy with that, and there is a procedure. I refer here to an interesting publication by our colleagues from a joint project. And so I'm not going in detail, but you can consult all this where we are, but it's obvious as there is nothing in Belgium in terms of a concrete plan. There's even not a choice for clay or which layer. And we spent 30 years on studying the Bohm clay at 220 meters, but we have no idea if that is transposable, that experience is transposable to 400, 500, 600 meters in the Yppresian clay, which is a different clay layer with different characteristics and different layering and different fractioning. So we're very far from having a concept. Next slide. So quickly on the financing, because there are some interesting links between what I said till now. This is in full development. So if you look at the committee who is managing these so-called Synatom funds, the Synatom, by the way, is the 100% daughter of Electrabel NG, but managing the spent fuel, but radioactive waste from nuclear power plants, but also responsible for fresh fuel. But in this case, it's about the back end of nuclear. And so they're also managing these funds, and they can spend 75% of their own funds into NG Electrabel under certain conditions, but still, they can, it's like taking money from one pocket and put it in the other pocket. So, interesting element here is the discount rates. So, this committee decided that, given international financial context, this interest rates were too high in 2015, and so they had to be lowered to 3.5% in 2018, and that is about half of the reason why there is a 3 billion increase needed between 2015 and 2018. So the capitalization of the fund, a part of interest rates, the growing interest rates, is of course immediately linked to the assumptions on what is a proper discount rate. I will come back to that in the next slide. And so there is, given the fact that we don't really have a plan, but maybe we have to go, the hypothesis that we have to go twice as deep. The ONDRAF has made a first assessment last year in 2018 that it would increase, almost triple the cost assumption for the geological disposal. But there's a high uncertainty about that. On top of that, there's a risk for the availability, as I mentioned. If NG goes bankrupt, or more like Electrabel goes bankrupt, so is that the end of our money? Importantly is that there could be a link. I mean, if something contradictory is that the more problems there are for nuclear waste disposal, and the more it gets delayed, the more it gets interesting for the owner of the nuclear waste, because they can simply say, okay, costs increase, and next slide, it's actually what Synatom explicitly says. They say, yeah, it might be twice, 3 times as expensive. That's not very convenient. On the other hand, the ONDRAF is proposing to delay it with 30 years. So 30 years of more interest, if we put the interest rate high enough, problem solves itself, because we just keep growing the capital. So it's a big thing I think we need to look at, that if there is serious and there are increasing doubts about the feasibility of these projects, but in one way it is quite convenient for the producers of nuclear waste. And we really have to be careful with this, that they don't get away with this. Yeah, this is a very interesting contradiction there. So next slide. So some conclusions. We don't have anything in Belgium for the moment, formally speaking. So 30 years of research, maybe it will have some use, maybe not. Maybe if I listen to Dr. Thuillier, I really doubt that it is feasible at all. I mean, a non-homogeneous thin clay layer, which is close to aquifers, which is very vulnerable for this disturbance, and with all the technical problems mentioned, is there any way a possibility in Belgium to do that? I have some serious doubt listening to all these arguments. There's a high uncertainty about the costs. And obviously we should not forget that there is a proposal on the table in Belgium to delay the phase-out of nuclear power for 2 of the 7 nuclear reactors. Instead of closing them in 2025, to do it in 2045. And that's a whole complexity in itself, because it will be the higher burn-up fuel that will be generated the latest, which requires, in principle, a longer cooling period. And so there is no plan on the table to lay out the whole consequences, technical consequences of producing the highest burn-up above 50 gigawatt day per ton fuel at the end of the whole process. So nobody really thought this through, what the complexity of that is in terms of the timing. So, thank you.
Je vous propose